Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's EdTalk webinar series featuring Saby Subramanya, a certified data protection officer and a certified data protection privacy and EU GDPR practitioner. Today's topic for EdTalks is GDPR compliance risks, exposure, and mitigation in higher ed. Today's presenter is Saby Subramanya. As discussed, he is a certified data protection officer and a certified data protection privacy and EU GDPR practitioner. Saby is accompanied with our EdTalk facilitator today, who is John Wanamaker. John is our executive director of Campus Consortium. Again, we'll take the questions at the end of today's presentation. Please note that you can type your questions in the chat box or your questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to Mr. Wanamaker and Mr. Subramanya. Over to you, John.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Ed Talk. I am John Wanamaker. I'm the Executive Director here at Campus Consortium, and I want to thank each of you for joining us today for this Ed Talk series on the important topic of GDPR. I am sure it will be an engaging and informative session that you all will walk away with some really insightful information around what GDPR means for higher ed and how you can help your institution become compliant. Before we kick off, I do want to give a little bit of an overview as to the Campus Consortium. We are a 16-year-old non-for-profit organization. We're an education association with thousands of members across the globe. Campus Consortium's mission is to help members across the globe reduce the time, cost, and effort associated with implementing enterprise IT services by leveraging shared IT services, lessons learned, best practices, so that each member can avoid reinventing the wheel when adopting new education technologies for their institution. We are supported, our work is supported by a series of technology partners, and we'd like to thank those tech sponsors, which you can see listed on the screen here. These companies here are working with us and support our broadcasts, such as the Ed Talk series. We run a regular series of broadcasts featuring some of the most up-to-date and relevant tech topics and trends that are impacting higher ed and campuses today. We are supported by our sponsors with other work that we do in terms of outreach that we do with a series of publications, different white papers, research that we're publishing, certainly case studies and success stories of where institutions have implemented grants that the consortium has awarded and the impact that those grants have had on their institutions. None of this would be possible without the support of our sponsors, and some of those are Unified, Quick Launch, Oracle, Black Belt Health, and Salesforce. Now, I'm going to take a couple minutes and give you an introduction to our speaker today. Saby's work includes extensive experience on IT processes, IT security, ISMS, IT governance and risk, project management, IT infrastructure, and security. He's worked in the banking industry, energy and utility, infrastructure, BPO and insurance, as well as in education. Saby has led many initiatives managing overall operational effectiveness by providing thought leadership, implementing best practices, and developing partner relationships in collaborations with global sourcing governance teams. He has worked extensively in implementing and aligning customer solutions to industry standards and best practices in addition to GDPR. Saby also has a really good understanding and knowledge of compliance requirements pertaining to Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and he is also presented and has consulted in PCI DSS, SSAE 16, and so forth. He has in-depth end-to-end management experience, helping customers quickly resolve critical problems and issues through innovative and practical solutions, leveraging his wider techno-functional and managerial experiences. He is with us today to share with us what GDPR means for higher education and to discuss institutions' path to becoming GDPR compliant. We're excited to have Saby join us. He is one of the leading global assessors in GDPR, and we're excited to hear from him how GDPR and compliance is impacting education institutions across the globe today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Saby, and wish you the best of luck, and thank you for being with us and presenting on this important topic today.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It'll be nice for me an opportunity to share the knowledge that I've gathered about the GDPR, which is very hot in the market, which is very much applicable across the industry at this present scenario. Apart from what John gave out my introduction, I also have some experience on various region global exposures, which makes me to understand local privacy, which are applicable for each region. That adds value for me to understand what exactly the GDPR is meant and how it is applicable for region-wise. Can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. Let me just run a overview about GDPR. We maybe heard GDPR. It is known as General Data Protection Regulation, which is introduced last year by European law, which will replace the existing European law so that it will be a commonly applicable data privacy law across Europe and UK. Before GDPR was introduced, there were region-specific laws applicable across the EU, and which was not having much of an rights or authority given to the users or the data owners or the data subjects or their own citizens. So the GDPR gives a lot of powers to the European residents and the citizens, and also UK residents and citizens. And also it's cut across all existing data privacy across Europe. And if anything that is not mentioned in GDPR, that can be borrowed from the existing data privacy law in the US. As we know, the GDPR regulation has got about 99 articles, 11 chapters, and 173 recitals. More of the terminology used in GDPR is legal-based terminology. There's a misconception that a GDPR can be well handled by the legal team or the people who are practicing legal. So that's not the fact. Though the language GDPR speaks is all about the legal, a lot of technology understanding is required. So that's where techno compliance consultants will help better to get the GDPR implemented for an organization. GDPR came into effect from 25th of May 2018, and it is applicable globally. This is the only compliance or regulation, I don't call it a compliance, I call it as a regulation, which is applicable all over the globe. And many organizations across the globe is very serious about the GDPR, and they have already started implementing, and many of them have implemented. GDPR also talks about the breach notification. It talks about how data transfer has to happen internationally. It talks about the privacy by design and privacy by default. It also gives a lot of importance for the data protection officer. While moving to the next slide, let's understand before we go to the Okay, let us understand why GDPR is all about. Uh, Organizations, institutions holds our personal information. When I say personal information, it is not just only the name of a person or an email address alone is not a personal information. So any information which relates or points to a data subject is referred as a personal information. So any institutions or organizations which holds personal information is required to be compliant with GDPR. By holding data, personal data improperly, organization could be at risk and the organization reputation may be at stake. And also, as per the GDPR, there could be a heavy penalties which will be levied if there is any data breach that happens, which will not be uh, proved, which cannot be proved in the ICO, the Information Commission Officer who governs the entire GDPR. And it also enables to have a robust process within the institution and organization so that each personal information is taken care, avoiding any data breach and also avoid any reputation of an organization. So now, having said this, let us see why GDPR is how GDPR is will help for higher education. In higher ed, we'll be having students' information from EU and UK. We'll collect information. There are ways and means which we collect information of the prospect students from EU and UK. It could be through online inquiry form, online registration form, or we may have EU and UK faculties supporting the institution, and also may have colleges present in EU and UK. Also, there could be possibilities that we'll be having a newsletters, e-newsletters, wherein we'll be gathering information of the EU residents or citizens, or could it be alumni located in EU still have their information in our institutions? There could be possibilities that we'll be having a distant learning students located in EU, or there could be various other research and development activities where we as an institution can allow or encourage students across the globe, especially students from EU and UK. So that is how, that is why GDPR for higher education will be more of a focus. With this slide, I would like to understand, to keep this more interactive, I would like to understand how applicable is GDPR compliance to your institution. So this, you can answer the question by selecting the options provided. So that will help me to understand better, and we can have much more interactive section going ahead. You can go ahead and poll whatever is applicable for you. Chris, I think we need to move on to the next slide. Okay, this gives a good response. I can see that about 52% say that somewhat it is applicable. GDPR is compliant for our institution. I see 4% say that not applicable. 44% say that very much applicable. That's a good understanding. That gives me a good feedback and have more interactive session going ahead. So when we moving on to the next slide,
And we are done with the polling. We have the results on the screen.
Okay. Oh yeah, we have 53% agrees that administration is pushing for GDPR compliance. That's a good sign, in fact. And 20% disagree, no opinion. It's good to see 53% because that indicate that the administration is really concerned about the GDPR and it is a top-down approach. Yep. Now, can we go to the next slide? Okay. Now let me run through the challenges that we face when we implement or about the GDPR. The GDPR talks about increased record keeping. This is only because GDPR concentrates more on personally identifiable information of a data subject. So it asks that any information that is processed, stored, or discarded, all those information has to be recorded and kept and keep maintaining those records for future usage. And third-party risk management, though any of the other compliance ask for third-party risk management, here GDPR emphasizes more on how you take care of the risks associated with the personally identifiable information of a data subject. Usually other compliance and standard talks about the information technology and other sensitive information, which is business critical information of an organization or an institution. But as far the GDPR is concerned, the risk management has to be revisited to see what are all the risks associated with a personally identifiable information when those information are shared with a third party for whatever processing activities it may be. And that also, the other challenge is privacy impact assessment. This is a significant additional resource needed to be allocated to develop an effective data privacy assessment program. Generally, other compliances and standard like ISO 27001, GLBA, or FERPA or HIPAA, they have their own set of impact assessment that has to be performed. But when it comes to GDPR, it requires more information. It gathers more information, and also it sees how secured, how strongly an institution or an organization is securing the data, especially the PII data, the personally identifiable information of a data subject. And most importantly, the breach notification to the ICO, Information Commission Office, which, as I said, which is the governing body for the entire GDPR, how soon the notification has to be made to them if there are any data breach that happens. As per the GDPR, the notification has to happen within 72 hours once the organization comes to know about the data breach that has happened. And the complete data lifecycle management has to be maintained, well maintained, I would say, right from the entry point of the PII information, PII data, till it is discarded. The complete data lifecycle has to be managed, and stringent data security controls has to be implemented. Of course, considering the business critical information, most of the institutions we would have implemented certain technical and organizational controls, but more emphasis, but with respect to the GDPR, more emphasis has to be given to the PII data, and also should understand and consider the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the personal data. So these are all the challenges which is faced by the GDPR. Going to the next slide. What happens if an institution is not compliant, or if institution or an organization is non-compliant with a GDPR, what is the risk that an organization or an institution will going to face? As for the GDPR, uh, the GDPR is becoming more uh, worrying topic or more important topic across the globe is because of its design, because of the power that it has given to its data subject, and also the fine that is levied if there are any data breach that happen. The fine is $20 million or 4% of an organization annual global turnover, whichever is higher, depending upon the severity of the data breach. So this is the significant penalty that GDPR non-compliant organization or institution may go to face if there are any data breach that happens. As I said, in addition to that, GDPR has empowered the consumers or the civilian more power, so they can dictate or they can ask what an organization can do with their personal information. And what it also goes one step ahead and says that they have to disclose all the information of a data subject. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Yep. After completion of OneYear, we already completed 1 year of GDPR came into force. This is an overview of what we call it as GDPR 1 year anniversary. How many companies have been compliant, how many companies have been fined, how many data breach that has happened across the globe. We have a statistics that is presented. How many cases that they have received. I could see there are many complaints that they have received. There could be data breach notification that have been received. So it's this image depicts the seriousness of the GDPR across the globe, irrespective of the nature of business an organization is involved with. Can you move on to the next slide? Thanks. So just to give an highlight, these are all the few companies, well-known companies who have been fined. Facebook is one among them which have heavily fined. So also the Google, Uber, Equifax. There are various legal entities which have been fined. There are certain some of the higher ed institutions which have been fined. There are other various organizations in different line of business that have been fined for the data breach or not being compliant with GDPR. It's just not being compliant. Though they claim that they have compliant with GDPR, it doesn't mean that, they have not taken care of the personally identifiable information so that there is no data breach that has happened. That was a fact with Facebook. We might have seen in the news. They claim that they have implemented GDPR and they have taken care of their customers' information. And then when there was a breach that happened, the court was, they were pulled in the court and serious fines were levied on them. So also with the Uber, you might have come across this news. Their customers' information got compromised, which was available, or some of their information was sold. So that's how they have to go through these penalties. Moving on to the next slide. GDPR revolves about principles and data subject rights. Before I get into the data subject, here data subject refers to an individual whose personally identifiable information belongs to. For example, if an organization or institution is holding my personal information, then I'm referred as a data subject as per the GDPR. So GDPR has got some principles and 8 data subject rights. The principle which GDPR asks for any organization or institution to follow is the information of a data subject, whatever information they hold, it should be very, very accurate, and it should use the data subject information for the purpose only what they are supposed to be using it for. And they should minimize the usage of the data subject's information, which we call it as personal identifiable information. And they should also limit the storage of the information. Normally, what happens if we have any information, we tend to have that information throughout, irrespective whether it is required for our organization for whatever purpose or not. We tend to retain those information indefinitely. So one of the principles says that you have to limit the storage of the information, of the data subject information, and it should be accountability. There should be clear accountability that should be demonstrated. And it also talks about lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. An organization, if it's holding any data subject information, it should disclose why those information is relevant for an institution or an organization. And it should be very, very transparent at any given point of time. If data subject asks for any information, it should be in a position to share those information with our data subjects. So that's what all about the transparency, lawfulness, and fairness. And integrity and confidentiality, of course, if an institution, an organization is holding any data subject information, personal identifiable information, that information have the integrity and confidentiality of that information has to be well maintained. Now talking about the data subject rights, what all rights an individual has been empowered rather, as per the GDPR, is at any point of time, data subject can object to process his or her information until the organization or institution proves that those information is required to meet some legal of the law of the land, legal purpose of the law of the land. So right to object is one of the rights, and right to be informed. Each data subject has to be informed by the institution and an organization, mentioning why they are holding their information, what is that they're going to do with their information, how long they're going to hold their information. All those has to be disclosed, and what the data subject has to do if their information have to be forgotten, or any changes that has to be made. All those information has to be provided to the data subject, and data subject has got a right to restrict the processing. At any point of time, they can restrict the processing. If I have given a permission for an organization or institution to process my information for XYZ purpose, on later date I can request and stop the organization not to process XY, and then they can process only the Z part of it. The right to rectification, the institution or organization should give the rights to the data subject to rectify their information at any given point of time. At any given point of time, they will be having the right to erasure of their information, and at any given point of time there should be a facility for the data subject to access their information. And also data portability, when the data is being transferred from outside the organization or outside the region, those information also has to be updated, and permission has to be taken from the data subject. When the data subject also has rights to limit the automation or decision making and profiling of their personally identifiable information. So these are all the rights. The more rights has been given to the data subject as per the GDPR. So that is why GDPR is so very popular and so very strong when compared to any other compliance and standards in the market. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So now let us understand why GDPR matters to us. As I rightly said in the beginning, we'll be handling various personal identifiable information. We'll be also be getting, we could land up in paying heavy penalties, need to have a robust system to secure the personal identifiable information. And also we will be understanding and giving more importance how the personally identifiable information has to be handled in the entire data life cycle. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Now, I've been saying personal identifiable information, which is also called as PII. We normally come across this acronym PII when we are talking to any of the person who are aware of the GDPR, and this is the main focal point across the GDPR. Personal identifiable information is any data that will help to identify a person. For example, if I say Saby, there could be n number of Saby across, but if my email address or my postal address or my mobile number is associated with my name, then I'm identifiable with the particular, with that name to me. So that is how it is called as personally identifiable information. Whatever information which identify a person is called as a personally identifiable information. Like we have listed out, it could be name, identifier like a database IDs, IP address. Of course, yes. If I'm accessing any information online, and if I'm entering into filling up some online form wherein I've mentioned my name, but they are collecting the cookies. The cookies may collect my IP information and things like that. So that also refers, the IP address of my personal home network is also comes under the PII. And location, data, contact and identity information, like that, anything that refers or points to a particular person is called as a personally identifiable information or PII. There are other sensitive information which talks about the region, the religion, and all, and the criminal, if there are any criminal records, and all those are the sensitive information. There's a separate classification for the sensitive information or sensitive data, which is wherein extra care has to be taken, extra controls has to be implemented if any organization or institution is having or holding or processing sensitive data of a data subject. Can you move on to the next slide? We would like to understand what data that my organization or my institution is processing is covered by GDPR. We may be wondering, like, okay, GDPR, is it applicable for us? If so, what information if we are processing is applicable as per the GDPR? As I already said, any information, any PII information, if we are receiving it, processing it, storing it, or sharing it, then we fall under the category of GDPR and we have to be GDPR compliant. It could be in any form. If there are CCTV cameras installed for the security reasons, then again, we have to have the GDPR, we have to come under the GDPR in a purview, and we have to take care of the GDPR compliant. And there are various means and ways where we can disclose what we are doing or what we are, how we are processing the personal identifiable information or PII of a data subject. And also the organization should take care of securing the PII information by various methods. Could it be encrypting the information when it is at rest, when data is at rest, when data is at transition, or when data is been displayed? It so happens that, you know, in normal way, we tend to display or share the information to various people within the organization or within the institution if those information is not, if those information may not be relevant to the users. So GDPR also says that you have to restrict the information sharing. The applicable information, the appropriate information has to be shared with appropriate users only. So all these things has to be reviewed, revisited, checked within our organization to be compliant with GDPR. Can you go to the next slide? GDPR also says that an institution and an organization should have a data protection officer. A data protection officer is a point of contact for anything and everything related to GDPR in an organization. So he'll be the point of contact for the data subjects. He'll be the point of contact for the ICO. He will be the he will play the advisory role within the organization if any changes that has to be made within the technology or within the process, or for that matter, any changes that are going to make which affects or which alters the PII information. So the data protection officer plays a vital role in the GDPR. He will be the decision maker, and he will be the person who will be questioned or who will be answerable for the various regulatory requirement, if it is from the organization or institution's customers, or if it is from the ICO, or from any legal entity, or anybody for that matter, whoever wants to know anything about the GDPR. So DPO, or the data protection officer, is the point of contact. And data protection officer also takes care of the vendor risk assessment. He'll be overseeing how vendors, he'll be rather dictating the vendors how their personal identifiable information has to be handled when they are processing, when the vendors are processing the information. And also there are various activities as per the mandatory requirements as per the GDPR, which has to be, you know, updated, maintained, and which will be audited. Though there is nothing, there is no official auditing procedure for GDPR till date, which will be which will come into effect very soon. But internally, as per the GDPR, it says that the DPO should be taking responsibility and review the certain set of documents, mandatory documents and requirements that is, you know, that as per the GDPR, he has to keep updating it. He has to maintain those records and play an advisory role for an organization when it comes to any change in the technology process which affects or impact the PI information. Next slide, please. Now let us understand the journey in the GDPR compliance, where to start, do what, how do we come to know that we are GDPR compliant? Usually the practice is we need to we need to understand our existing current strength, and also we need to understand how are we really gathering or collecting or storing or processing any PII information which belongs to EU and UK residents and citizens. So there are certain activities that will be performed in the initial stage, and then there will be the main important thing is the awareness has to be created within the organization. So that awareness has to be made, and also the gap assessment, which we refer, has to be done, which will be done in the initial stage. And then with the outcome of the gap assessment, we'll be doing a remediation plan has to be done. One has to plan to mitigate the gaps identified. So when we talk about the gaps, it is all the gaps is relevant, or is with respect to PII information only. When we say GDPR, it primarily points and refers to PII information, and whatever controls you apply, it should be to safeguard the PII information. Once the remediation plan is done, then it moves on to the fully mature model, wherein we should be having a data protection officer and have a defined set of policies and processes which will be reviewed on a timely manner, and also manage the data breach if at all, if there are any, and also revisit the inventory, data inventory, especially with the PII data inventory, and also see if there are any data subject requests which if at all, if there are any, that has to be handled the way it has to be handled, and also to do a periodic internal GDPR compliance audit to make sure that we are compliant, not just at the time of implementation, but also as an ongoing process. We should make sure that we are compliant all the time. And periodic training and awareness has to be provided. So all these activities will make an institution, an organization, fully matured GDPR compliant organization or an institution. Okay, having said this, I would like to ask a question here. Where do you think, or where do you position your institution on the GDPR journey? Do we have that question? Yep. I will request you to take a couple of minutes to answer this question. Where do you position your institution on the GDPR journey? Chris, again, request you to sound me off when the polling is done.
Yes, Saby, so the polling is done and we have the results on the screen.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks. Wow. Wow, I see 30%. It start 57% started. Fantastic. That's a good sign. And I see 13% GDPR compliant. Wow, that's a good number. So that gives a clear understanding how serious we are about the GDPR, and we also this polling gives me a clear understanding, the participants understanding about the GDPR. That makes a real thing to it's a good way to have an interaction with the people who already know the GDPR, who have heard about the GDPR in whatever percentage that may be. Good. Can you go to the next slide, Chris? Yep. The GDPR compliance is sliced in three phases, usually. it will be in the 3 phases. When an organization wanted to have their the GDPR compliant to be implemented or done for their organization, uh, there'll be a project kickoff. The more importantly, the scope definition. That's where the that's where we understand where the PII information is within the organization or the institution, and also to dig and segregate the PII and the sensory information within the organization. There are various activities, mandatory requirement as per the GDPR, which will be performed in the gap assessment or gap analysis, like data flow diagram. See, the GDPR asks, uh, the regulation asks for an institution and organization to maintain the data flow of the PII information. When I say data flow, we have to track and maintain the record of the PII data flow path. So that has to be documented. So those activities will be performed in the gap analysis, and also various controls that are in place within the organization or institution will be evaluated and understand how strong those controls are to take care of the PI information. And also, we'd like to understand how the asset register is maintained, how the risk assessment is done, in terms of other compliance and standards. We term it as risk assessment, but when it comes to GDPR, it is termed as DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment. So these activities will be performed, which will clearly showcase where an organization or institution stands with respect to GDPR, and what should be how their journey with respect to GDPR has to be. The phase 2 will be more of addressing the gaps that was identified in the phase 1. It can be mitigated through by implementing various technical controls or by organizational controls. Those are the activities that is termed as remediation activities will be performed in the phase 2 remediation roadmap, and phase 3 will be the maintenance of the GDPR, the compliance itself. As I mentioned earlier, performing internal audits, maintaining various mandatory mandatory documents, updating the data flow diagram, addressing various data subject requests, and also addressing internal employees' concern when it comes to PI information. And if at all, if there are any communication that has to be made to the ICO, all those will be managed in the phase 3. So this phase 3 is more of sustenance of the GDPR compliant. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have done, I personally have done assessment and remediation activities for a couple of institutions within US. DMAC is one of them, CSN, NUNM, and SWTJC. We have done assessment on various compliance, which we call it as Unified Compliance Framework, which involves GLBA, GDPR, FEDPA. So these are all the activities, to name few of the institutions within the US. I personally have handled these institutions among other institutions for the GDPR and other compliance and regulations. Next slide, yeah. Okay, now we have reached a stage where you can go ahead and ask any questions you have. Well, I'll be more than happy to, myself and John will be more than happy to answer.
Very good. Thank you for that, Saby. There was some terrific information, a lot of information. thank you for walking us through all that and sharing that with us. Before we dig into questions, I do just want to remind everyone that we will follow up with a copy of the slides for you all to have. We'll send those to you, as well as a recording of this session, so that you will have that at your ready and can share that with your colleagues as well. Quite a bit of info there, Saby, and really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. I do have a couple of questions that have come in, and if we have a minute or so, would like to have you answer one of those. So firstly, one of the questions that's come in is around, is this going to be some sort of ongoing addition changes to what is required for GDPR, or can we think about this as a one and done kind of thing?
No, if it's not initiated, we have to do it, and it should be an ongoing activity like any other compliance or regulations. As I said, there are certain mandatory requirements which has to be maintained, updated and maintained on a regular basis. This will be an ongoing activity. But as I said, compared to other standards and regulation, there is nothing like external audit that is still available for applicable for GDPR at this point of time. I think there are some news that they may come up having an auditing body for the to audit any organization or institution if they claim that they have implemented GDPR or they are GDPR compliant.
I see. And a follow-up question to that we've got is, how would you suggest that one stress to the administration of their institution the importance of becoming GDPR compliant?
That's a good question. I saw in the polling that the administration wanted, percentage was more that administration wanted to implement the GDPR. It's all the way better to make the administration understand the importance of the GDPR, because the institution is name is at stake, the reputation is at stake if any data breach that happens. Because knowing the fact that the Information Commission Office is not taking it very lightly, anybody and everybody whosoever information we are processing can complain to the ICO saying that, or complain your institution saying that, why are you holding my information? What makes you to hold my information? Who has given you authority to hold my information? So any such question may arise. That time we'll be in a position finding no answer for that question, which will again lead to face the legal consequences as per the ICO guidelines. So that is the point which has to be definitely discussed with the administration, and also the penalty, which definitely makes everyone understand why it is required.
Okay, one quick question here. We're running out of time, but there is a question about some of the institutions that you highlighted on your slide there, and a question about how one would promote that their institution is GDPR compliant when recruiting international students. Is that something that you would recommend that is highlighted?
Yeah.
When recruiting?
Yeah, when recruiting, there is a certain set of documents which has to be completed. So that itself will make the students aware that the institution is GDPR compliant. And also our website speaks, the institution website speaks that they are GDPR compliant.
Very good, very good. Well, Saby, that was a terrific presentation again, and a lot of information, and we'll be following up with all of your folks who have registered and attended here today. I do want to just remind all of our audience today that Campus Consortium runs a series of grants, and you'll see those on the next slide here. One of those is for GDPR compliance, so we do encourage you all to visit campusconsortium.org, and we will where you'll see the gap risk assessment grant there, as well as a number of others. So again, encourage you to visit campusconsortium.org and follow up with any questions that you have for us. We do have another EdTalk that we are teeing up for later this month. That is going to be on how to utilize technology and peer-to-peer instruction in the classroom. So look for an invitation to join us for that conversation. But with that, I would like to once again thank our presenter, Saby, and tell him that we are looking forward to continued information coming from him from GDPR, and we'll be sharing out all of the resources with you all today. Everyone, this is Campus Consortium signing off from EdTalks. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.